Can I just, I think that someone has left, and it's a shame because I think it was Sylvia. I can't quite now find her comment, but she was asking what this has got to do with decluttering, and perhaps I wasn't very clear at the beginning that these things have taken our time when they arguably they shouldn't have done. And so that's what I meant really by decluttering. I feel that if people are spending time trying to get into critical thinking with their students, be they primary age or adults of 50, 60, it makes no difference to me. So all the things that I've noted here I identify as things which have wasted our time. If I can just quickly carry on with that thought, I want to get to questions too, but I've been looking at trying to read the questions as we've been going along. The other thing that is really important to say is that, to repeat really, is that I've no inherent objection to this stuff. Somebody said, isn't this about, if you do little bits of critical thinking or learning styles and so on, isn't that eclecticism? And yes, it is, of course. And I have absolutely no objection to eclecticism. On the contrary, my objection comes when people say they're eclectic, but they can't tell you about task-based learning, for example, which is one of, or the lexical approach, which are, pinnacles, in my view at least, pinnacles of what our profession has created over the last 30, 40 years. So eclecticism is fantastic, but you've got to spend time finding out about that stuff in order to apply it sensibly.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Steve. I really think this was a thought-provoking session. I'm sure a lot of people are considering some very controversial issues, and there are some questions in the Q&A box already. I do have a few questions myself. That's why they brought me here, I think. But I wanted to go back to the beginning of your talk, where you basically say that nothing has quite...
I'm a virgin.
That's okay. So nothing has quite changed in language acquisition since the 80s. Learners are not exactly learning faster today. And I just wanted to ask you, maybe it's not about learning faster in a way, but about making more people learn. I wanted to have your opinion on that. I wanted to quote Rod Ellis as well, who's an acclaimed linguist, and he says that the 90s were all about cognitive linguistics, and then we have the social turn. And maybe what we're getting at here is that after some new developments, let's say, in second language acquisition and other fields, maybe we're looking at learners who were not successful before, and now they can be a little bit more successful. But in terms of speed of learning, yes, maybe nothing has changed that much. So would you care to comment on that?
Is your question about the volume of learners that we're now dealing with as a profession? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I don't think. I mean, teaching in the late 70s and early 80s, we had classrooms full of people. The socio-economic development around the world. I don't want to get political here, but they have increased the need, the necessity for people to think, stay attention, be aware here, because I'm not saying this is true, but have caused people to think that they need to learn English as a lingua franca. And so that's the reason, in my view, that we've increased the volume. In terms of success or failure as language learners, personally, over all those years, I've seen literally no change whatsoever. The same, I wish there was research on this, but I'm pretty sure there isn't. I wish I'd started it in 1980 myself. I think that the same percentage of people pretty much around the world fail as succeed. Yeah, so that's my answer. I don't think there's a connection.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for answering. I do have another question about the same topic, especially concerning some new developments in bilingualism and how we nowadays can actually look inside people's brains using neuroimaging technologies, for example. And there are a couple of theories, for example, that will basically claim that biliteracy, using or translanguaging, for example, code switching can actually help students learn a second language, or nowadays they're even calling it an additional language because it doesn't matter the sequence in which you learn the language. So wouldn't you say that there are some changes that we should be aware of, at least some basic principles of how the brain acquires a second language that were not possible back in the 80s, for example?
Yes, absolutely. That's what I said at the end of the presentation, that things may change and that we need to keep a critical eye open. I have not said that I'm against brain-friendly learning. What I've said is that I'm against people setting themselves up as being brain specialists when they're simply not. If you're a neuroscientist and also a qualified teacher, fantastic. I will welcome you to my bosom.
Yes.
So that's fantastic. What's not fantastic is when, no, let's keep this narrow corridor here. This is teachers desperate for an answer to their problems who get hold of an idea, and it's a little idea, and they unfortunately they invest so much in it and nothing actually happens. But in 5 years' time, Andre, if you've done the research and if you can spread it to people in a way which is understandable, that'll be fantastic. What Wonderful. We don't want, it was Claire Krempsch, don't ask me the date of this paper, but she wrote a paper which I found absolutely fascinating about domain-specific language and how teachers and researchers have a kind of divide, because the researchers maintain their own academic or quasi-academic jargon.
And exactly.
Yeah. And I've been there too. And teachers are left out of the loop. And she said all those years ago, well, not that many, but late 80s, I think, I can't remember. She said, we've got to break down this domain specificity. We've got to get people to communicate. So we've got to have researchers like Rod Ellis, who I was fortunate enough to study under, who's able to explain stuff in a way that teachers can understand. This is not to say that teachers are stupid. This is not to say that teachers are not intellectual. It is not that. It's about making things accessible to teachers, right?
Excellent. Excellent. I couldn't agree more, Stephen. I'm really happy that you're actually saying this. And one of the things that the mind-brain education field has been trying to do is exactly that. Not so much focused on language learning, but general education. And of course, there are many differences there. And I think one of the things that I studied as a master's student in psychology of education is really how to communicate that to teaching audience, that in a way that they can actually understand and use those principles, because the jargon really is what makes teachers, I guess, get away from it, because it doesn't make sense, it's not applicable, or it shouldn't be applied like we discussed before. And I think that goes, please.
No, I'm agreeing with you 100%. 100%.
Yes. And Neil Harris had, please, please, go on.
I noticed a question from someone who hasn't got a name. This is an anonymous attendee.
Oh, yes.
Kind of it's a shame. But I wanted to pick up that question, which was I'm going to say she, because I don't know if it's a gentleman or a lady. You say these are gimmicks to make money. How is CELTA, for example, any different? They pushed multiple intelligence for you. Absolutely, they did.
And learning styles as well.
Absolutely. And I have been involved with, not so much with CELTA, but with TESOL, in trying to get them to stop doing that. Quite recently, learning styles were still on the curriculum. So yes, you're right. There are gimmicks here. CELTA or TESOL, Trinity College TESOL, they're not perfect animals. There's stuff to be learned, and they're quite big, and they're certainly now money-making institutions. But I would remind you, I have a great interest in the history of our profession. And I would remind this anonymous person how CELTA began. I'm not going to give you a lecture on it, but it was John Haycraft in the 50s who'd just opened his first school in Paris, and I think one in London, one in Paris, and he had no teachers. And so he set up this thing which was called the 4-week course. And so it was set up to provide teachers. The collateral effect of that, of course, was to give people employment, give people who didn't have any employment. And it is fantastic. I know that lots of people object to the 4-week course because it's 4 weeks, but trust me, it is if you do a good course, and there are plenty of poor ones around, it's a fantastic institution. I'll shut up now.
Well, wonderful. I do want to go back to this idea of evidence-based learning, because it's actually what Neil Harris is asking here. And maybe you can tell us, Steve, what do you think should be done then? I mean, of course, science is making progress. We have new developments every day, basically. Not all of them should be applied. And maybe Neil is actually raising his hand. So why don't you ask your question, Neil, if that's okay?
Just unmuting myself. Steve, thank you very much indeed. I've kind of was writing questions as I went along, simply because I found everything that you were saying so stimulating. So I think what I'm going to try to do, following on from what Andre has just been saying, and he and I think both share an interest in evidence-based learning, is to ask your advice. I mean, I remember, rather like you, I think we were there in the same event, where people like Mario Involucri, Judith Baker, were expounding on the values of NLP. Books were published, and now we find ourselves, both of us, rejecting that. You make a very strong argument for teachers to be teachers and to recognize what they're not. We're not neuroscientists. And therefore, what advice can you give to people like me as a teacher, so that we can embrace what to me seems to have a strong evidence base? For example, looking at things like spaced repetition, but to be as certain as we can be that we don't make the mistakes of yesteryear, and that by introducing what we read and what we understand as lay people to be an evidence-based for general education, and in terms of spaced repetition, nation, mirror, they all tell us that these are good for vocabulary acquisition. How can we avoid the pitfalls of blindly, and of course one answer to this is critical thinking, going down the route of making our teaching more evidence-based, and then find in 10, 15 years that we're having to reject it in the way that we're rejecting NLP, multiple intelligence theory, and so on. What safeguards exist, would you suggest?
Neil, thanks very much. This is a really great question. First of all, I think that evidence-based learning is not part of a cult, which NLP was and is. So NLP was something which grabbed you by the short and curlies and pulled you in, and you became a kind of acolyte, if you want. What you're talking about, I would say, let's go back to grammar translation. Let us agree that grammar translation, although it still exists around the world, we know that grammar translation is not the best way to learn, right? It's not the best way for people to acquire language. It is a way, but it's not the best way. We now have evidence which suggests that it's not the best way. And so evidence-based learning, spaced repetition, and so on, are things that we can, I hesitate to use the word prove, but as close as we can get to use the word prove, we can. So for me, the answer to your question is twofold. First of all, and perhaps most importantly, use your gut. The fact that you're asking this question tells me that you are already using your gut, your teacher gut, if you want. And the other part of the question is to keep informed. In other words, watch the research, find outlets, find sources which will either support or challenge whatever it is that you're thinking about. So articles which look at spaced repetition in support, and articles on the other hand which challenge. Actually, there's three parts to the question. The last part is I push this as hard as I possibly can, is action research. Set up a project, man. Do something with colleagues. I wish teachers would do this. It's one of my passions. And I can't get them to do it. Perhaps it's me, I don't know. I hope that helps.
Wonderful, Steve. And if I may add something, I've been reading Carl Sagan lately, and he says that in the absence of evidence, remain skeptical. Just look for the evidence. And I feel like that's the thing. Things should be falsifiable. We should be able to actually devise an experiment to test if those claims work or not. And we're never going to prove them, I suppose, because science always suggests it may work this way under certain conditions. So I really like this conversation, but let's get back to some of the things you said, Steve.
Yeah. Okay. Can I ask John? John, you've just written a question, but could you ask the question? Because I think it's also quite an interesting one.
Perfect. Are you with us, John?
John Milton.
Yeah. Can you hear?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that me? No, you mentioned that from what you're talking about, I think critical thinking, how it was being promoted by OUP and stuff. And I was wondering how can we, I suppose it leads on from what you just said to Neil there, how can we as mere teachers, wherever we are in the world, how can we look for signs or decide or look for the signs that should give us an indication that this new fad is indeed just a fad and that should be ignored, or actually it's something that is worth investing in? How is it?
It is a question really which is heavily linked to Neil's from just now.
Yeah.
I'll take you back to using your gut. I think add to that, if it promises the world, drop it like a hot brick, because it ain't going to work. Look, we've been teaching language from how many, but just the people on here, I wonder how many years cumulatively we have as teachers. I mean, it must be hundreds of years. And nobody has all the answers. I certainly don't have all the answers. All I've got is a couple of things that I've realized over, and it's taken me a very long time to get there. So you're going to make mistakes. I know you, John. I know that you're, relatively new teacher. I also know that you're a brilliant teacher. So I would trust you easily to know how to do stuff. I'd also trust you not to fall for the latest fad. If it promises the earth, it's a fad. Drop it.
Excellent. Now, concerning critical thinking, Steve, I think a lot of people mentioned something in the chat box, and I was wondering if critical thinking cannot be looked at as a transferable skill, something you already know how to do in your mother tongue, and then you just simply transfer it to language learning, and it's really a means of using the language in a particular context. Can you comment on that, please? I mean, it cannot really be taught in a way, right? I mean, you can use it.
I mean,
yes.
As I've said, I have no objection to critical thinking. I just wish people knew more about it. That's all. And buy this little book. Incidentally, just as a quick byline, I have this book, and I wrote to the publishers and asked them if I could put one page up on my presentation, and they said, "Yeah, man, it'll be $49." So I said, "Okay, thank you for that." No, so I decided I wouldn't do that. But I'm telling you about it because it's a great little book, critical thinking concepts and tools, and if you can learn about it, if you understand it, if you can practice it, if you can work your way through it and go through the various stages that there are in order to become a critical thinker, then you can do all kinds of stuff with it. But beware, if I come and learn Japanese with you, I want Japanese. I don't want to be taught critical thinking. Thank you. If, on the other hand, you say, I'm teaching a course of Japanese with critical thinking, okay, I then have a choice to make. If you say, I want to teach you Japanese with mindfulness, I have a choice to make. So this is, so really my argument is upside down and downside up.
Yeah.
Don't waste time. And also make sure you know what you're talking about and make sure that students know what they're getting. Those are the two strands.
Excellent. I think somebody mentioned here in the chat box, I can't find it here. Isn't it a fad that in a way basically makes publishers use this as a buzzword to sell more books. I mean, you cannot really sell ELT materials without using the word critical thinking, right? Can we consider, yeah.
100%, 100%. I mean, I did a few jobs for OUP, and I found myself actually promoting the Q series in some Arab countries, and having to say, you know, critical thinking is the thing, and here it is, and blah blah blah. And I really wish I hadn't done it. I sold my soul to the devil because, well, yeah, because I don't agree with it, and I didn't agree with it then. So yes, absolutely a money-making scheme. What's next? I don't know.
Yeah, and John Milton just mentioned here that when he sees a fad, he always hears your voice in the back of his mind, Steve. So great, thank you for mentioning that. Yes. Well, I think we can move on to my next question, which has to do with pseudoscientific ideas in ELT, because we've covered multiple intelligences, learning styles, NLP and all of that, which at a point, I mean, we still didn't have a lot of evidence to say that they didn't work. Nowadays we do, and it's really robust, I'd say. This is something I studied in my master's course in psychology of education, but those ideas are still being pushed. There's an agenda. So what do you see as the dangers of pseudoscientific ideas in ELT, Steve?
Wasting time.
Yeah.
That's it, really. When I was putting this presentation together, I took out a couple of books that I started with. I've got them right here behind me. I'm not going to grab them now, but I got them out, and I was just going through them and thinking to myself, you know what? There's a lot of sense in here. I mean, kernel lessons, which unless you're as old as me and you've been teaching as long as me, you probably won't have heard of it. But it's all situational. It's functional, situational. There's very little in the way of hard grammar, and we know now through the interface hypothesis, of course, that, you know, hard grammar explanations and so on can fall on deaf ears. They don't get, you know, declarative information doesn't get converted into usable information. So there's so much stuff that we know now, and going back to look at those old books made me think, wow. I mean, these were common sense. It's common sense. You want to learn English to use as a citizen of the world. You're going to be in situations. If you're going to be in situations, you need language which emerges from situations. I don't think I've answered your question.
Actually, you did. Yes. But then that brings me to Neil Harris again, and maybe he wants to open his mic and talk about flipped classroom. Neil, do you want to ask your question? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have been, and I'm very grateful to Steve, although perhaps a little bit perturbed, to sort of, because I've been a great proponent of the flipped classroom within the context of student efficacy. So my starting point has never been one of kind of, we'll do the flipped classroom because the students are going to somehow magically learn more and learn better. But I think it does have value in terms of perhaps the development of self-regulation. But I think my question was more to do with the last year and a half and online learning, where time and Zoom, time in the Zoom classroom is precious. Even more so, I think, than in the physical classroom. And I wondered, Steve, whether, given your encyclopedic knowledge, whether there's any research that you're aware of that can argue in favor of or against an adoption of asynchronous learning outside of the Zoom or the Teams live lesson, which actually does positively contribute to better learning and potentially quicker learning, or not?
The quick answer to that is no, in the sense that I don't know of any such research. I of course, am now retired, so I don't really teach anymore. And so I haven't been, and I'm happy to say, I haven't been forced to teach online. I think I would find it extremely difficult. And I have the greatest respect for those who do. And I'm pretty sure that new ideas have developed. And I'm pretty sure that if you look at the idea of flipped class, the principles of flipped classroom, that is getting students to prepare something before the lesson. I'm pretty sure that that is going to lend itself to what you're calling a Zoom lesson. But I don't know if there's any research on it. Perhaps Andre does. I don't know.
Well, Neil, I'm not aware of any research, but I can tell you from experience, mentoring some teachers in Brazil, that in many cases, that was the only way anything could be done at all, because there were problems with connection, for example, in many public schools in Brazil. So if you didn't have the chance to interact with the materials before the synchronous part of the lesson, then there was nothing else, And many times they were actually accessing through their phones, which was incredibly complicated. I mean, how do you even share your slides if you're looking at your phone and you can't even read the text on the slides, for example? So it was quite common sense, I'd say, to make sure that there was a platform where students could go to and access the materials and then apply whatever it is that they had learned, air quotes here, in the synchronous lesson, right?
I mean, I think there's a real danger of sort of hegemony here. I have done a bit of work with the accreditation unit in the UK, thinking about, the rollout of accreditation for online learning. And I think the assumption is, and I do use the word assumption advisedly, that good learning and teaching online must have an asynchronous element to it. But I'm not sure that we've never necessarily stopped and said, well, why? Maybe one real benefit of this session this afternoon, and thank you both, is that's perhaps a question I want to go back to and discuss with them.
Yes, I think Gabi wants to comment on that. Yes, Gabi? Or she just mentioned that she'll try to answer.
No, I was trying to answer. Gabi asked about, Gabi, are you there? Speak to me.
Hi, Steve.
Hi.
Yes, there she is.
Yeah,
Hello,
yes.
Gabi.
Hi. Hello to you both. Great session, Steve and Andre. Really loving it. But I do feel like I want to challenge you, Steve.
Good, go for it.
I mean, first of all, the flipped classroom. I mean, you've probably seen my comment in the chat box that I was actually doing it long before it became fashionable. So I have to say that I very much disagree with you on this one. I don't feel that the flipped classroom is just a fad. But what I really want to say, Steve, is when I was listening to you, I felt like, I at university, I studied philosophy. And I remember in my first year, one of my lecturers said, oh, look, you don't have to, if you just complete the Greeks, okay, don't worry about the rest of the philosophy. You've done it all. And then I feel like, I feel a little bit like this is the message you may be giving to people. Don't resist new ideas. Don't engage with new ideas because they are not going to bring in anything new to your knowledge. So just stick to the well-tested methods like TBL and the communicative classroom. I feel like the point I'm trying to make is, if we, like as a teacher, okay, we have to experience all the new methods ourselves. We just have to go through the process. We can't just reject ideas. If there is a new idea, if it's a fad, then we have to engage with it, because this is the only way for us to actually develop. So you engage with a new fad, and then you either embrace it or you reject it. But by rejecting it, you kind of reinforce your existing beliefs, right? So we need to be kept on our toes as teachers. So I'm actually quite happy that there are so many new fads, because they make me think. This is the point I'm trying to make, that perhaps we should be encouraging teachers to actually exploit new ideas, but just keep the critical eye out for.
Well, that's the key, really, isn't it? Keeping the critical. I mean, I said at the end of the presentation that, first of all, I have no inherent objection to any of that stuff, and secondly, that we indeed must keep a critical eye open. We must look for stuff that's coming in. But I don't think that, I think the problem has been that it's been thrown at us and teachers have just accepted it without very much question, because they need a hand, because it's so difficult to do this job. Experimenting on paying students. No, that's not right. We don't do that. We don't experiment on people. You're paid to teach language, teach it. If you want to find out about the latest fad, which is using llama hair to line students' chairs, that's fine. But you do it outside the classroom. You do some research outside the classroom, or you read the research. You do not, in my view, experiment on students. That's really not right. It's unethical.
But if I may, Steve, because I feel like perhaps it's just a matter of how you actually experiment on your students. I hate this word experiment on your students, but perhaps it's just if there is a new fad, you don't just take it and use it in the classroom without checking it out elsewhere first. Perhaps it's just the matter of taking little bits from the new fad. Again, I hate the word fad. You just take little bits of from the new method and you somehow implement it into your daily practice. It doesn't mean that you change as a teacher overnight. It doesn't mean that you really experiment on your students. It means you test it one step at a time, always having your students in mind, because this is your priority. So it really depends on how you approach the word experiment with the new fads.
If I get this correctly, Gabi, if I may add something, you are talking about doing action research and going with your gut, which is something that Steve mentioned, right?
Yes, I'm saying embrace it, exploit it, not at your students' risk. So not, you are not the most important person in the classroom, it's the students, but you are also important as a teacher. And if you want to develop professionally, you can't just stop at some point only because someone says that we've done it all, that the best methodologies have already been tested.
No. What's happened is that we've been taken over by critical thinking, by mindfulness, by learning styles that everywhere you look, despite the numerous articles which say that they don't work, they don't exist. And this is what I'm objecting to. I'm objecting to the fact that we're being pushed along by publishers of all descriptions and not made, but almost forced to use stuff which doesn't do anything to the learning acquisition process. I have never said close your minds. Absolutely not. What I'm saying is we have got some good stuff which we've tossed out. The Kleenex culture, isn't it? We've tossed out pretty much the lexical approach because Michael Lewis, unfortunately, didn't make a very good case for it. We've tossed out TBL. I see that there's people in the chat thing here who use TBL. Jen, I think, is one of them. Fantastic. I love TBL. It's great. And that you have to ask yourself why that isn't stronger. Why isn't it more known? Perhaps because it's and why is the lexical approach not being better adopted? Because they're more challenging. That you need to know stuff about those in order to put them into practice. So my message is definitely not close your mind to new ideas. Absolutely not. It is critically assess both old ideas and new ideas. Do not kid yourself that something is working when it's not.
And then that brings me to a very important question, Steve, and I think I'm going to challenge you on this one as well. We do have internal biases, as you know, there's lots of evidence coming from psychology, for example, that a lot of people can follow a certain technique or strategy based on a gut feeling that has absolutely nothing to do with evidence. how do we make sure that we're actually looking at what the evidence that we have today, the state of the art today, can offer, and be aware of our internal biases so that we don't basically do things just because we feel like they work well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I had a pound or a dollar or a ruble or whatever you want to do, for every teacher who said to me, this is what I do and it really works, I'd be a rich man. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you because I'd be on a boat somewhere.
Or I've created a new method, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And it really, the key phrase is, and it really works.
Yes.
So the answer to your question, I think, is about communication. I mean, teaching is a very isolated profession in professional terms. Of course, we're constantly communicating with our students. That's, in that sense, it's not. But in terms of us, we're very isolated. I teach in my classrooms here. You teach in your classrooms there. How do we find out? How do I find out what you're doing? How do you find out what I'm doing? How do I test my internal biases? How can I do that? Well, I think the answers are very clear, really, and we need to have a kind of a new evolution, and really it doesn't have to be a fad. We can have a new evolution of teachers talking together. We can have teachers meeting together from all over the world in things like this, for example. And thanks to gallery teachers for putting these things together. This is not mine, but in general, this is fantastically valuable, I think, for teachers. Action research doesn't have to take place amongst immediate colleagues. Action research can take place in Japan and Nigeria at the same time, right? We have the technology, as they say. So all of that stuff together. But Andre, your question pinpoints really an awareness, the necessity for being aware that we have internal biases, that we have that we can easily kid ourselves into thinking that playing music to my students is all they need. No, well, no, it isn't. Yep.
Yes, wonderful. And then that brings me to another very important question, because I think, when I studied psychology, for example, there's a lot of research showing that a lot of teachers believe in neuromyths. And when you look at TEFL, for example, or TESOL conferences all over the world, they are accepting proposals that propagate neuromyths. And we've known that for a very long time. And they are talking about quick fixes and, magical formulas and everything.
Absolutely,
so,
absolutely.
Yes.
No, look, when I was asked if I wanted to do this, my first question to Gabby was, can I be controversial? And
Yes.
I hope I'm not. I hope I'm okay.
You're not disappointing, I can say that, yes.
Gabby said, please do. Yeah, she said yes. And so, but I'm not being controversial for the sake of being controversial. I'm being controversial because I'm passionate about this stuff, because I see people being sucked down holes, like rabbit holes, and doing stuff which is not, it's not right, it's not useful. They're wasting their time. And so to those people, probably people who aren't even here, right? To those people, I say,
yes.
Have another look. Check it out. Are you right? Are you sure you're right? Check it out. If you're right, fantastic. Look, if you're teaching critical thinking and all your students have become literally experts in critical thinking, good luck to you. But
Excellent.
most aren't.
Yes. I think it really boils down to the idea that teachers are always looking for a pot of gold, and then anything that catches their attention in a big conference. And that's the problem, because maybe they can't tell whether this is actually based on the evidence that we have, or if it's something else. They will watch it because it makes a lot of promises. It promises the earth and it doesn't deliver, like you said. Well, Steve, I think we're coming to the end of the session, but I think Neil is still here with us. I know he has another question here. Oh, there are a few more questions. So maybe Neil, I will leave you out this time because you asked two already. So how about Maria? Maria Josefa, do you want to ask? Do you want to open your mic and ask Steve now? You have a very interesting question here. Well, maybe she's not here, so I can just read the question. Do you think that the emotional intelligence of our students has become primarily important when they are learning a new language? What about the teacher's emotional intelligence? So maybe I guess she wants to know your opinion about emotional intelligence in general, I think.
I think I'm absolutely the wrong person to ask. I'm knocking on 72, and I don't really recognize the idea of emotional intelligence. You can call me, you can call me names, an old fogey and out of touch and all of that. But so I'm not the right person to ask. I think you need to go and ask somebody who's a bit more well-informed. I won't say younger, but I will say a bit more well-informed on that particular area.
Well, I think maybe Maria Josefa, you can ask another question if you're here, but that's what Steve gave us. And Jen has a final question. Is it all about need? You have it, you learn. You don't have it, you don't. So the rest is fluff or stuff. So is it all about need?
Oh, I love that question, because it so is about need. However, there is a collateral discussion, and that is who creates the need. Do students come into your class? I don't know what age groups people are teaching, but I've taught children who are so small that if you walk across a room, you tread on them, up to people who are, in their 70s and 80s. And my experience is that they don't automatically, some do, but mostly don't automatically come into the classroom with need exuding from their pores. They don't. Sometimes they do because they have a very, very important business requirement or social requirement, and that is the motivation, really. And therefore, what I'm trying to say is that I think part of our responsibility is to create that need. I think part of our responsibility is to create the conditions in which intrinsic and extrinsic motivation can grow, can flourish, and people become keener and more interested and more needful, in a sense, I suppose. So I put a lot of responsibility on the teacher. Yes. It's a tough message, but that's how I see it.
Excellent. And I think I still have time for one last question, and this one is really my question. You say keep an open mind, but you also say that second language acquisition holds all the answers, that we have more than 100 years or so of research in that area. So what are you telling us, Steve? Should we look at, let's say, cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience as well, or should we really
first of all,
second language
just a tiny correction. I'm not saying that SLA research has all the answers. Absolutely, I'm not saying that. I don't think it's true. I am saying that it's a good reference point, and we do have 100+ years of SLA research. And if you're not especially into that kind of stuff, then I have books that I would recommend. I'm not going to do it right now, but people can contact me if they want to, and I will do that. Books which are accessible, which you can find out about the key points in our history, in the history of language teaching, which lead us to where we are today. And so those are the things that I would begin with, and that in a sense is creating the ground. And from then on, you need to keep yourself up to date by reading ELTJ or one of the other good quality journals.
Excellent. Well, I think this brings us to the end of the session, Steve. I'm very, very honored to be here with you. I've been following your work for some time now, and I hope everybody had fun, everybody learned something. It was really rather controversial at times, but that's good. I think we have to think critically about the stuff that is being thrown at us, right, Steve?
I think so. Can I just say thanks to everybody for attending. I'm so happy to see people I haven't seen for a while. Chloe, it's very, very nice to see you around, and Jen and other friends who I haven't seen for a long time here, and people I haven't met too. Thank you very much for coming along, and I hope I've given you at least some food for thought.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, everyone. And make sure you check Gallery Teachers. More masterclasses are coming, and I hope they are as thought-provoking as this one.